So we're going to kick off the last session for the conference, and here we're going to start concentrating on how we retain our place. Growing pains are affecting our environments, our communities, and our place. How do we protect the magic of Nelson? We're going to kick it off with a bit of a panel discussion with some local people here. William Samuels is a Whakatū-based architect and chair of the Nelson Marlborough branch of the New Zealand Institute of Architects. He is a co-founder of Nelson Tasman 2050, a non-profit group of built environment professionals who are striving to enable quality regenerative development and vibrant communities in the Nelson Tasman region by advocating for the creation of resilient, sustainable, affordable, equitable and community-focused urban environments. Alan Gray is a principal landscape architect with Boffin here in Whakatū Nelson. Alan has led award-winning public realm delivery outcomes in the US and Aotearoa, including the development and adoption of Te Awa o Whakatū, Nelson's central city vision. And Richard is the co-founder of WIC, Whakatū Intellectual Capital Kohanga. Richard has a deep appreciation of the importance of place, honouring place, knowing place, and building on place. He has worked as a corporate executive in Times Square, Silicon Valley, and the downtowns of Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, and Portland. He now teaches at Nelson High School. He has noticed that as much as students may love Nelson, they don't see Nelson as a place they can come back to until later in life. Can you please welcome these three to the stage?
I don't need the slides. So kia ora, I'm Alan. Obviously presented a little bit on Nelson City Centre yesterday. And I guess, I'm trying to find lots of ways to weave what we've heard through the last 2 days into the sort of fine granular kind of pixel of our city centre. So obviously it relies on our river networks, our forestry systems. All of these things are a big part of what will make the city centre, I think, prosper and prepare in the future. There's work underway in that space. We've got to change our forestry strategy right around our city centre. There's a right tree, right place piece of work that's underway right now. And we are looking, I think with the city centre, everybody has a city centre experience. So in this work that we do, when we talk to people about our centres, it's obviously highly competitive ground for that public realm. How do we have typically 18 to 25 meter road reserves. It's not a lot of space to try to fit all the demands in it. But it's really important that we sort of think about a bold vision that moves a city forward. Cities are in competition. That investment, you want to find the right people that are attracted to come to Whakatū Nelson, that there's a point of difference. I think that's really important. I think it's also about this. We've had this big atmospheric river event last August, and a new council that's come in, half the new mayor, half of the council, the elected members are new. They haven't been part of that sort of journey in the last 3 years where a lot of bold strategy work that's been kind of interconnected has developed. And they're looking at annual plans and things that are really focused on recovery. And there's a risk that if we keep looking too far in the back, we can't move ahead. And I think for all of us as practitioners in this space, this highly competitive space, we need to be not just designers, we need to be compelling storytellers, we need to bring the community along and with us, and we need to be champions to do this work, whether we're in the council or working as consultants outside of that. So I think that's really important. We also think that we need to find new voices to be part of this. And obviously, I think yesterday in the presentation, I showed the data that shows that Whakatū Nelson is a city that's growing older. And we want to make sure that we can define a city that can draw, be part of a vision with our youth and bring those youth voices into it. So we'll hear a little bit about that today too. So, and my last sort of parting comment is, along with the champions, And I've heard a few times strategies, they sit on shelves and gather dust. I don't think that's true. I think the champion has to drive outcomes before that stuff even sets. And even with a new change of government, or local governments, we need to be able to work with our political leaders, our elected members, with our mayors, and bring that leverage with that community backing you to be able to fulfill those projects. And that's why receiving $36 million from the central government to do a flagship project here in Nelson, I think, is a great opportunity to try to retain and also build on new identity for our city. So thank you.
Alrighty, I might just get the slides up if I could. Cool. First off, thank you for having me here. I'm an architect, so I feel like a slight imposter at the Landscape Architects Conference, but as Kutchakorn said yesterday, I feel like we need to work together as much as we can. So thank you for having me here, and thank you really to the organisers of this event. I think it's been really amazing and quite inspiring to be a part of, so thank you. I came from Nelson originally. I'm from here. I was born and grew up here. Back in 2010, I moved to Melbourne to work as an architect there. So I do want to give a shout out to Rob for making that such an awesome city to live in. It did make it perhaps a little bit harder returning to Nelson a few years ago. I think having been in an environment that really values good design outcomes, good urban environment, and sees the benefits of that, and actually makes the effort, a real serious effort to progress those things. It made it quite difficult, I think, returning to Nelson. I do think that Nelson has been suffering a little bit. I think that some of the vibrance and actually some of the identity that we've had is probably slipping away a little bit. And there's reasons for that. I would really suggest that the underinvestment in Nelson as a place over the last 30 years is a key driver for that. And so underinvestment both from the public sector but also from the private sector. I think there's aspects of Nelson which are feeling quite tired. As Alan said, we have a town centre which has 6,000 or 7,000 people coming here to work each day, and there's only 100 people who live here. And that's shocking. I think I see Nelson really in a similar context to perhaps Melbourne was back in the 1980s, where it didn't really have that vibrancy or that life invested into it. And so from that point of view, I actually think it's a really exciting opportunity, because in some ways we have a little bit of a blank canvas. We can really define what our city is. We can define our own identity, which is fundamentally important. The work that Alan talked about yesterday, I think is absolutely a shining light in terms of trying to define an identity for Nelson. It is really trying to tackle some of the key issues and to improve Nelson in ways that it really needs to be improved. But I think there are some challenges that are being faced with that scheme. And in my mind, the central challenge is how we go about growth. And this is not just true of Nelson, but throughout all our regional centres. So growth doesn't, I think, look like what Alan was showing yesterday. Growth, in my mind, is more this type of thing. This is the vast majority of the development that we have in Nelson, and it doesn't happen around the CBD. If I have a pointer, we've got Nelson over here. This is the Richmond Plains area. When I think of Nelson's identity, there's a few things I think about. One of them is our primary industries. This is what Nelson was born from. This is what we came from, and this is now being utilised for development. That's the key area that we're developing. We're not developing in the city. We're developing out here. This is the status quo approach. Essentially, development is being driven by the developers, and so that is a real challenge that we have to address here. I think if I'm able to go back, the latest development out here on the Richmond Plains is called Berryfield, which I find is deeply upsetting because they named the suburb after what they destroyed to put the suburb in, which is just, I find that just a little bit sad. So that's a key challenge, I think. So to really get that vibrancy, to get that identity and that life back into Nelson, we need people here. We need people in the city. We need people who are just living here, who can, who are able to be on the streets. At 5 o'clock on a weekday afternoon in Nelson, it just goes dead because there's not people living here. We need people in the city, but the more and more that we do this type of thing, the more and more we're draining all that investment and those resources and those people away from where it needs to be. So I see this as being a really fundamental challenge that we face. The other challenge that we're facing, which Alan mentioned, is that the market isn't ready. The market isn't ready for raising residents, so having people housing in the city. The market is always complaining about loss of car parking spaces, and when we're trying to do some nice urban interventions or bring in some green space into the city. And so that's a really key issue and one that we actually all have to address. And so I think what we need to be doing is actually trying to figure out how do we change the narrative? How do we make the market ready? We're in a room together with people who know the value of good design. We know the value of well-designed built environments, of well-designed urban areas. And so we should be really vocal about that. We need to be loud. We need to shout that from the rooftops as this is a good design outcome. And I think that if the market's not ready, we actually have to look at ourselves and say that we've failed. We have failed to adequately advocate for good quality design outcomes. And so the more and more of this sort of stuff that's happening, rather than focusing our attention on the areas that's needed, I think we can only look to ourselves and say that we need to do better to advocate for the best quality outcomes. So with that in mind, about a year and a half ago, I joined up with a couple of others in the Nelson region, so Timo and Magda, who are here, urban designer and another architect, and Jan, who is a civil engineer. And so we formed a group which we called Nelson Tasman 2050. The idea with that is being a collective of built environment specialists to try and fill a bit of a gap in the discourse when it comes to what we're talking about in terms of growth and development, and to be an independent body which is able to advocate for best practice design, best practice built outcomes. And so we've been quite busy over the last couple of years doing that. So what we're really advocating for is the idea of livable, socially conscious, sustainable, and affordable built environments. And that comes from, there's a number of different ways we can tackle that, but we're wanting to see housing within the city. We're wanting to constrain greenfield development. There's a number of areas which we want to see targeted by council, such as development of neighbourhood spatial level planning. We want to see the introduction of planning guidelines which advocate for or which enable good quality or quality intensification over haphazard development. I think we can all acknowledge that Nelson will get intensity. There will be densification happening over the next 10 years. There's a very real risk that that density is going to be haphazard or unplanned, and we could end up with some pretty bad outcomes as a result. So we need to make sure that the planning regulations are in place, which is able to enable good quality outcomes. We've also been pushing particular policy outcomes for council. We've been strong advocates for the idea of a Nelson Tasman Urban Development Agency, so that if council are going to be pushing certain ideas, then they actually have some ability to do it. I think what we find at the moment is that council doesn't really have the tools, and so they end up relying on developers, and developers kind of, we know what they do. So the way that we have been doing this is, how have we been advocating for these is a few things. We've been publishing lots of newspaper articles and opinion pieces. We've been meeting directly with council, both in terms of presenting to councillors and also meeting with council staff. We've been having public meetings and public workshops, presentations to the community, a huge number of submissions to council, to central government. We've also, on the back of some of those submissions, we've created public submission guides so that for members of our community, if they're interested in a particular topic, we're able to break that down and say, look, these are the things that you should be raising with your local government. We created a series of questionnaires for local council candidates prior to last year's local body election, just asking some questions about their approach to the built environment. That revealed that there are some absolute nutcases who are running for council. But it was a good outcome because a lot of them actually went and thought through some of their policy positions on this. And we have had feedback from a lot of people that their voting choices were informed by the results of those questionnaires. So I think that was a good outcome. We have been looking at things like alternative medium density standards and various policy proposals and also things just like design case studies. So I just want to, I've got just a couple of items here. These are just some of the submissions we've been making. This has been taking a huge amount of time, and of course it's we're just volunteering. So some of these are fairly robust. The Future Development Strategy, which was introduced last year, is what's defining growth in the region. And we had a 37-page document. We had that a property economist do a peer review of it. We had a scientist from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change presenting as an expert witness on our behalf. And frankly, Council kind of ignored that. So we also had submission guides, and we had hundreds of submissions of support for our response there. So that's what we've been doing. And I've got a couple of questions here which are just, they're not really rhetorical, they are genuine questions. How do we disrupt the status quo approach to growth and development? Because at the moment I see that, and I see that everywhere happening. What the status quo approach is it's developer-led, and council, although they're trying to sort of guide it in a certain direction, they're essentially just enabling a lot of that greenfield growth, and we're losing those outcomes within the central city, which is what we need to be aiming for. And beyond that, more broadly, just who defines the vision for our city's future? Is that council defining that, or is that the community? I would argue that needs to be the community, and I think we're probably going to touch on that in part of the discussion. And really, how do we make that happen? Right.
Kia ora. So if William as an architect is an imposter, then I as a high school teacher and a former corporate executive must be a sub-imposter, an imposter. I'm not sure exactly where I go with that, but it's not any place flattering. So, I'm going to talk to you briefly as from an advocacy point of view. I'm a convener of an organization called WIC, which is the Whakatū Intellectual Capital Kohanga. And our whole focus is looking at intellectual capital as a driver of our community and how that plays an important and synergistic role with urban design. WIC believes that urban transformation begins with trying to resolve economic and social challenges. It's not just about tarting up the place from our perspective. So then it means that what we're advocating is an investment-oriented approach and not focused on sort of a rates mindset that tends to dominate these discussions in council chambers. We believe that we need to be more nimble and strategic thinkers when it comes to urban revitalization, remove the expenditures straitjacket, and contemplate what opportunities for progress are there in this community that actually invests in our social capital that creates an economic engine for our community. Let's keep in mind that Mariana Mazzucato from the University College London has, in her book, The Value of Everything, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it, has shown that governmental entities create public value through the investments that they make in public good, which also means public structures, public places, and public capacity building through the built environment. Whakatū Nelson actually has a rich history and potential to build on, especially through its intellectual capital. Nelson invested in itself in the early decades of the community back in the 1840s and later in the 1800s. The Nelson Scientific, Literary, and Philosophical Institute was the first of its kind in the nation. We had the first library here in Nelson for the whole country, built from that institute. One of the first polytechnic institutes, what became NMIT here. The Nelson system of public schools became a model for the rest of the country. The Cawthron Institute, again, a trailblazing institution for the rest of the country. And we were among the first to have a school of music and to have a public art gallery. Nelson was a place that valued education, the life of the mind, the power of ideas. Think of Rutherford or the world of wearable art more recently, innovation, inventiveness, and what we now see today as intellectual capital or a knowledge economy. In those days, Nelson leaders saw the value of building civic institutions. These forebears attempted to raise up its body politic through access to information, civic engagement, and a sense of shared community through a planned urban core with vital institutions that were worth investing in, right? Investment. Very enlightened for the late 19th century and early 20th century. Of course, if we're going to take an investment approach, we need to give councils more revenue-generating authority and revenue streams. This is a real problem in New Zealand. Pinning everything on rates has cultivated this expenditure rates, neoliberal corporate mindset that is stultifying to any local authority developing an investment and innovation approach. It creates a superficial, polemical, and rationally flawed dialogue between residents and council. Civic organizations, like WIC, like William's organization, can advocate for change in ways council staff and politicians can't easily do, and give cover to them. Sometimes they just need cover to do the right thing. But it can also challenge and provoke and prod those staff and politicians. So we push them quite hard at times. This combination of catalyst and cover from civic advocates like WIC help councils be more effective. Cities that want change need critical friends on the outside of the entrenched power structure. And then finally, bringing back to some points that Alan and William have both brought up, and we'll have more on this in a minute. Our young people have ideas on what needs to be accomplished to create progress in our societies and to rejuvenate our city cores. We often don't give them, however, the platforms to be taken seriously as contributors to this dialogue. But today, at the end of our panel, we will. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We're just going to open up the floor to a few questions to the panel. So if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask these three guys, then yeah, by all means. And just to kick things off, you asked the question about who should be defining the vision for the future of Nelson. So just interested in who those people should be, and maybe you guys have got a few things you could say to that.
I'll start this off by making a bit of an observation, and this is not Nelson, but about Mapua. Mapua is, for those who don't know, is a village maybe about half an hour away, and it's a small seaside village. That is a village which has undergone some change over the last 20 years. There's a fantastic urban intervention in the waterfront, and it's made that a really popular, lively place. Last year, however, in the future development strategy, which is about defining growth, Mapua was identified as a place which is going to double in population. Meanwhile, there's developers who are looking to build huge greenfield development around there. We got involved with that because we were asked by members of the community who were really quite scared about what that meant for Mapua, about what that means for the changing identity of that place. And I think that the fear there was that it was council and it was developers who were defining that for them. So we did a presentation in a town hall session there, and that was, I think, quite a good session. There were members of council there as well, and basically to say that growth is going to happen. You know, it just absolutely is. But there needs to be a mindset change here, where it's not a case of we're passively accepting what we're given by council and by developers, that we need to actually have a plan in place. And so since that point, I think one of the private plan, the plan changes which were proposed for Mapua has been put on hold, and a spatial plan is being undertaken, and that is having input from members of the community. I'm not particularly familiar with the status of that, but I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. But beyond that, I think that and I'll hand it over to you guys, but I think that when we look at somewhere like Nelson and the identity, we do need to be talking about those younger voices, the people who are going to be here, and how do we get those people involved? So I'm not 100% sure of exactly how we do that, but I just think it's very necessary to be giving platforms to those who want to be involved to define our city beyond the approach of developers and council.
Thanks, William. I guess the traditional method that council sort of creates these plans is based on feedback they get in annual plans and that type of mechanism. I think that's beginning to change a bit, and certainly when I was living in Tamaki, there were Greater Auckland, there were groups that were real big advocates that would really help, much like Nelson Tasman 2050, help break down some of the issues with often really complicated type strategies and policies. Having that advocacy in there to help kind of break that down and also reach out into the community and bring those voices in are really starting to change the way councils start to think about doing the sort of business as usual work. New types of engagement, and this is something as practitioners, I grew up on the tools, loving to do design. I'm a kind of a drawing guy from background. But we quickly all have to become champions. We have to be politically astute. We have to be able to have hard conversations. We do have to be able to tell compelling stories. We've got to collect good data. And we've got to be able to kind of get people over the line with it, often in really difficult conversations. And not just one or two times in a big open house, really kind of getting small groups together, doing it many times. That is the way it's got to be done. And each of us is obviously outside of my comfort zone to do that facilitation and have those difficult conversations. But that's just where I've kind of had to grow into. And I'm impressed by what I've heard in this conference from so many of the other presenters. Kate's work, 800 meetings or something, or 800 people, I think, in the Atlanta area on the Chattahoochee. That is where the work is. And when we can't let go of the design, but we have to be in that space talking to people. I will just add one thing. Council's currently working with Ruff, Milne and Mitchell and the Youth Council on a new type of climate response laneway. So I'll be interested in Rory and Claire and the team and how that comes along. We are trying, or the council and I think the water design community here in Nelson is trying to reach in, find those younger voices and get them back here. We know that they're going to go to university. They might do an overseas experience, which is the Kiwi way and really important, but we want them to get back to Nelson when they're 26, not when they're 36 or in their 40s. So that's a challenge on us to make it a really good city.
Yeah, exactly. So just a couple quick points. First of all, as an advocacy organization, just like Williams, we end up having submission fatigue, right? There are so many requests for us to submit on so many things, and the level of detail, and I got a full-time job. I have 175 papers to mark during my term break, so it's like there's lots of other things to be doing. So submission fatigue, I think, is a real problem. It's a barrier to actually deciding who's going to have a say. Another issue that happens that really gets in the way is essentially how engagement process. I'll give you a quick example. So we're in the throes of arguing over a big ambitious library and civic center in Nelson. And the initial engagement for this project was in the middle of the day, right, at a very limited number of hours in a couple of locations. Now, it just so happened that one of those days I happened to have a free period, so I was able to go. And it was me, and it was the mother of one of my students, and it was another high school student who had been on basically an exchange program who was interested, and then a bunch of people who have hair the color of mine, right? and probably were substantially older than I am. And it really led to a very truncated and constrained kind of conversation. And then the final thing I'll say is, as someone running an advocacy organization, the people who want to work with us, they don't have time. Forget about, time pockets that are appropriate, and forget about the idea of submission fatigue. It's just people don't have the energy to contribute in a way. They have lots of great ideas, and we're missing out on them in the processes that we have now. So that's it.
I want to touch briefly on the comment about the Nelson Library. Richard's done a huge amount of input onto that. The Nelson Library, I think, is quite an interesting case. For those who are not familiar, it's a fairly major proposal in Nelson, which would be Nelson's largest ever public investment into a single facility. It of course attracts the usual responses, which is that we shouldn't be spending any money on public facilities and civic investment and so forth. I'm personally a big fan of it from that point of view of we need some of those things to bring some life back, so some advocacy work. However, last year there was the local body election, and then it became a political issue that a number of councillors were coming out and becoming opposed to the library, and various opinion pieces in the newspaper about cost and so forth. And this narrative became getting built around this idea that this is an over-budget waste of everyone's money. We should lower rates and not do anything in the city. And so that became the narrative prior to the local body election, electing councillors who are going to be making decisions on that. I am very well aware that there are a number of councillors who are very strongly supportive of it. You didn't hear those. There are a lot of people in the community who are also very strongly supportive of the library. So I got a little bit annoyed, and I wrote an opinion piece in the local newspaper, which I got to say, that was the only supportive opinion piece that I read during that entire election cycle on the library. I got a huge amount of negative responses. It was hilarious. But I guess the point is that, sometimes we do just need to be breaking the narrative. If we strongly feel that the narrative is incorrect, then we need to be vocal about that. We are the experts. We are the people who know the value of good design, and we can't just let a few old biddies on Facebook be the ones who are defining how our cities are built. It's us.
Sorry, it's me again. It's us who decide how these cities are built within reason. There are laws governing all of this, and as William is painfully aware, we've tried to work all the way up to the Minister for the Environment to influence something like the NPSUD, because that basically is what our councils use as a measure to justify urban sprawl. So what can we all do to influence those laws that govern what our cities are going to look like?
I mean, I think, Timo, you and I have had this conversation a lot. So I guess I think that what we need to be doing is looking at it quite holistically, both from the macro level and the micro level. I personally can't really speak to the idea of how does somebody influence the laws at that higher level. But I think that what we need to be looking at as well is just how do we make the micro interventions that we can within the existing laws to really get some really positive outcomes within our spaces. At the same time, absolutely, we look at a more of a macro scale. Absolutely, we could look at the national policy statements and see how we can amend that. I just think that the idea of relying on national policy statements to influence on the ground outcomes is really quite problematic, both from the point of view of timeframes, but also, the idea of the central government defining exactly what happens in downtown Nelson. I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think that should be really community driven. So yes, I would agree that absolutely we have to tackle those policy statements, but I think that we shouldn't utilise that as clouding our vision to the fact that we need to do immediate interventions, and we need to do that now. And I think that should be one of the priorities, particularly in Nelson. And I think that Nelson is an example. I'm so frustrated that there's nowhere nice in the city on a sunny day for me to eat my lunch. The only spot I can really think of is that I'll go to the cathedral steps and sort of eat my lunch over there. That is outside that central city. There is nowhere nice. So immediately, this is something we should be doing right now. We should be making those spaces available. And so I think that that's just a completely different path that we should be taking in terms of that national policy statement thing. But in the meantime, we just have to be just taking action. We need bold ideas. We need innovation. We just need to, kick people in the pants and just make things happen.
And I'm not going to speak to the NPSUD and some of the central government things. I can speak more from the market perspective, I guess, looking at Nelson Central City. And as you guys have walked around here, you can see it's a relatively small footprint city that's bound by hills. So you really have to grow up here. There is maybe 1 or 2 greenfield sites around the perimeter, and those are somewhat controversial. And you look at the areas out around Richmond and Tasman, and as William was saying with the Berryfields project, you are the greenfield, that sort of detached single-family home, that's relatively easy product for a lot of developers to deliver, is being done at the sacrifice of that identity, that horticultural, that rich sort of landscape out in Tasman around orchards and vineyards and hops gardens and these things that are really quite iconic as you drive through them. So how we intensify is going to be a big part of it. And when I say the market, doing buildings, apartments in the central city is really challenging. Those are really expensive projects to do. The development community here is starting to get into a little bit of that, but it's early days. We're going to need help. We're going to need better contractors, better sophistication to deliver those really challenging products. And then I think there's this market change of trying to get people out of sort of just the single family quarter acre and into something that's a well-designed, well-ventilated, good natural light type of apartment outcome. That's a challenge we're in because those are expensive projects to do. We think the market's coming around on it. There's probably a dozen projects in build right now of a product similar to that that's relatively probably 4 levels or under. It's starting to happen, but we need more work. We need more bold sort of developers to grab in and do that work.
Just a brief comment, and that is what else I think we need is what we sort of, the 3 of us on this stage have is we have collaborated with each other. So, we're an advocacy organization. Of course, William's a professional and an advocacy organization, and working with Alan when he was a member of council staff. And really, you do need that troika of outside advocacy staff and then professionals to get together and collaborate and figure out how we can support each other in a very intentional way, not through happenstance.
Yeah, thanks, guys. As part of the panel prep, we've obviously talked about a few of these issues for quite some time. But one of the things that kept coming to the surface was this idea about hearing a more diverse voice. And so we've got a couple of special guests with us today. Alex Taylor and James Matthews. They're both from Nelson College, and they've been through Richard's program. And so they're going to come up and speak to us about what they've learnt and some of their ideas about, how we can make this place better. So, yeah, welcome, boys.
So while they're coming up, I'll just mention, so during the last year, James and Alex were part of, we spent, our year-long theme was Reinventing Nelson, and it was, we did a series of field observations, field studies, interviews, and academic studies. Had a variety of workshops and speakers come in to try to help the boys actually approach social sciences from a real-life perspective, and they're going to talk to you about some of their perspectives from that. So, yeah, guys, do you want to use this, or you want to use that one? Okay.
Kia ora everyone, ko James tuku ingoa. And last year we were part of a class, Mr. Budvik's class, and our focus of the year was on urban design, with a more heavy focus on reinventing Nelson. As a class, we identified some issues that we believe were prevalent in the Nelson region. Some of those issues include that there are more people over 65 than under 16, the sunshine wages that we have in the region, and how a lot of young people leave in their late teens and they don't come back until later on in life.
Hello everyone, my name's Alex Taylor. So as a class, as said under Mr. Budvik, we split into roughly 6 groups, and we went and we identified certain issues with Nelson, as stated by James. And we decided to come up with a few main a few main solutions. So first off, this group looked at interactive urban public spaces. So they thought before I die boards, tag walls, and look what happened today boards, where people can interact with their actual public environment. And also looking more on the musical side, they'd have pianos that were put into the pavements and then simply pianos for people to go up and play. And they also did a survey from a few of the classes, and they actually decided that neon lights were among the most popular thing that people wanted implemented into Nelson.
And so the second group, their idea was on developing Central Trafalgar. All of you guys who are here now, you've seen that Upper Trafalgar Street has been closed down to cars, but their idea was that they wanted to make push further up Trafalgar Street and create a more people-focused area. One of the things they identified was that this was Trafalgar Street in 2009, and this is Trafalgar Street in 2021. As you can see, that's 12 years of potential design and changes that could be made, however, nothing was made.
So the third group, they mainly looked at transportation and specifically improving Nelson's bikeability. So they mainly looked at the Clarence Drive bike path as well as Waimea, and if you've seen Waimea, it's a pretty busy road, especially around school times. So they thought by increasing the overall bikeability with certain designs such as this, which is already seen in Sydney, Australia, and across many places in the world. And they've identified certain benefits, such as reduced congestion on roads, a safer way for kids and even older individuals to get into town, and then a means of exercise.
The fourth group, their idea was on creating new spaces in Nelson. And so as a group, instead of identifying a problem themselves, they went to 170 different students from all over the Nelson region to help them come up with an idea. And from the survey, they identified the main issue that the youth believed was in Nelson was that there was little to no spaces in the Nelson city for youth, and they felt that if any time they wanted to visit Nelson, it was going to come at a cost. And so their idea was on an area such as that where they could hang out and draw this youth into the city.
So the fifth group, they mainly, similar to the third group, they looked at transportation, but they focused on buses and public transportation. So they implemented ideas such as pantograph charging, a new bus app which featured a hail and ride system, and then also new bus centers that would accommodate the new fleet of buses.
And so the last idea was our group, and we called it Walk With Us. We wanted to have a look at bringing vibrancy and also increasing safety in the Nelson city. And so we looked to colourful crosswalks and painted asphalt as a means to do that. As a group, we identified a problem in Nelson, and that was that Nelson needed revitalisation. We thought that it lacked creativity within the CBD, and it was not a very unique place to walk around in.
So our group, which consisted of James and I and a few other people from Nelson College, we based this idea off of a personal experience from North Carolina in the United States. So while we were there, we were able to experience colorful crosswalks firsthand, and we noticed the overall liveliness of the area and the reduced traffic and the reduced congestion. And here are a few expert opinions. So experts have decided that asphalt art has a strong positive correlation with improved safety benefits, and here are some of the stats. So for example, researchers were able to see a 70% reduction in total accidents.
The reason why this happens is because colourful crosswalks bring attention to the motorists and to the pedestrians, and it makes them more cautious and alert. And so within our project, we came up with some concepts of our own. This was the first. We deemed it the equality crosswalk because we wanted something that represented the entire region, something that everyone could look at and they could feel home. The second is the sunshine crosswalk. It not only reflects the colours of Nelson, but also is a nod to the sunshine hours. The third is the ocean crosswalk. We wanted to reflect the changing tides in Nelson, but also the importance of the blue economy. And the final was our Karakia crosswalk, which spoke of safe journeys for motorists and pedestrians in the Nelson region.
So with this project, we went around Nelson and even further into the Richmond area, and we chose a few certain locations that we thought these colorful crosswalks could be implemented. So for example, the Nelson Airport, right as you arrive, the first thing that you would see could be a colorful crosswalk that would give you the overall sense that you're entering a new place, a new special place as Nelson. On the top right, there are two already existent school crosswalks that have the dedicated signs to make motorists stop. So we think that by putting colorful crosswalks there, it would bring more attention and also help pedestrians find the dedicated crosswalks. And then in the bottom right, if you may have seen already, Upper Trafalgar Street, near the cathedral steps, there's already two dedicated crosswalks. And if we could put a concept there that would overall reflect Nelson as an inner CBD, we thought that would be a great idea.
And so finally, we, as a peer, we looked at what all the groups had come up with, and we identified the two biggest issues that, from a youth perspective, we believe were evident in our city. And that was the first being that Nelson is oriented around older generations, not the youth, which means that there's not enough infrastructure to accommodate the younger population. So kids don't feel at place in Nelson, and so a lot of the time they don't want to stay here. They leave, as previously said, they leave early in life and they don't come back until much later, and that's because Nelson isn't oriented around those younger generations.
So touching on what the panel said previously, Nelson is more based around the older generations. So taking what the group said and the certain problems that they identified and the solutions that they came up with, we've found that Nelson needed more youth attractions, and especially ones that required little to no cost. Because Nelson, if you've ever been around there, it's quite an expensive place. We were trying to aim at bringing more people into town and then keeping them there. So versus people going in for like one-stop shops, they'd go in there and then they'd have more activities to take part in. Accelerating the modal transportation shift, so again, with the bikeability, making more bike lanes, making biking easier and safer, and then the bus transportation, making that more available to the public. More color, more greenery and creativity in the center, in the city center. So that would be like planter boxes that have been placed around, certain areas for people to hang out, and then parks and benches as well. And then more intentional placemaking, so more places for people to go, for more diverse communities, just to make everyone feel included within Nelson. Investing more in our civic infrastructure, so for example, sporting facilities like the Trafalgar Center here, libraries, as mentioned earlier, one of the topics of the council, playgrounds, and the community centers as well. And then also just touching on the vertical density of Nelson. Nelson's more of a single story, not very dense within the city. So if we can increase the vertical density, then that would bring more people into the city, and then you're looking at more of apartments and then more large shopping centers.
Thank you guys for listening to us. I think that as a peer and taking a whole, we're kind of representing the youth in Nelson right now. So I think that if I was to say anything, I think we just want Nelson to be somewhere that kids can go, they can hang out, they can have fun, and make it an overall better, more vibrant, colorful, and safe place. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex and James. We've talked a lot about, having a voice. I think having a voice really takes some practice, So, empowering our youth and having them along to events like this, I think it's so important for developing, great people in the future. So, yeah, another round of applause, I think. You guys did a great job.